We know. And great. So I wanted to start off just really quickly. I know we don't have a whole lot of time in each meeting like to get to know each other better, but we do have a few questions that should pop up in a poll for you to kind of tell us a bit about. The first question is, how are you feeling this morning? Do you feel tired? Do you need more coffee? Are you energized, or are you normal, kind of normal energy levels? So let us know. Oh, there's Dr. Haynes. Welcome, Dr. Haynes.
Hello. Hello.
Move.
Yeah, it's
Greetings.
good to have you with us, Dr. Haynes. This is Rosemarie, and we were just starting off our meeting. If you need a few more minutes to grab some coffee or something, that's fine, or you're welcome to stay with us.
I'm glad to be here, so I'm going to enjoy all of this. Thank you.
Great, yeah, great. Great, so we're doing just a quick poll on how folks feel right now, and kind of on a scale of 1 to 5, how folks are feeling about learning about cooperatives. And then the third isn't really a poll question, more in the chat. You had no choice but to say yes. But in the chat, if you would name the top 3 takeaways from our past meetings and readings that you've done, or discussions about cooperatives, or just any takeaway you've had so far that you'd like to share with the group. And if you can't think of 3 things right now, maybe during the meeting you can add some things that come up. So that'll be open in the chat throughout the meeting. So. Great. So I think everyone has had time, to do the poll. So I'll close the poll, but the chat is open. And here are the results of our poll. It is early. Great. So, well, welcome again, everyone, and thanks for being here. And we're excited to hear from everyone today. And we'll start off with Stephen Handy. And I'm not sure if you want to just briefly tell us, a little bit about yourself, Stephen, and then we can dive into your feedback on your readings.
Absolutely. First of all, let me reacquaint myself with Dr. Haynes out of the Dallas area. Tyrone Gordon is a friend of mine, and I talked to Tyrone about 2 weeks ago, and I met you through Black Methodist for Church Renewal, SBC 21, when you came and offered us perspective and had the audacity to allow us to think differently. So I'm always intrigued when you're anywhere, Doc. I appreciate your presence.
Thank you.
Thank you. I am not by necessarily choice a 4th generation pastor. I didn't want to do this because I don't like the model. And I contend that this is not what Jesus meant, but that's a whole nother conversation. I am grateful to be pastoring in my 12th year a downtown church called McKendree United Methodist Church that was on the Episcopal South Side, which means it was on the side of slavery. And I became the first African-American cross-racial pastor 12 years ago. And it was what they call the Obama effect every time I would preach on Sunday. So I was grateful to be in that space. We're probably the most racially diverse, ethnically diverse, class diverse, age diverse United Methodist congregation in the state, which is a pathetic statement to make in 2020, but it is what it is. We're working on planting more micro churches in this season than mega churches, and I don't have anything against mega churches. I think we're in a season where people want less content and more connection. So married with 2 children, and the baby boy, unfortunately, is home. And so my space is being rocked to a whole different level because we're negotiating space, and I'm not used to him being here. We've been empty nesters every semester, but he loves eating. My bills have gone up, my food bill has gone up, my water bill's gone up, all the utility bills have gone up. So I'm grateful that he's here, not in Chattanooga at UTC. The oldest the middle child will be graduating, God willing, and the creek don't rise, as we say, in December. He's taking 1 course. And I said, son, you really need to knock that course out of the park. He's also planning for the LSAT. So I'm a pastor, a reluctant prophet in this season. And I, unfortunately, am somewhat kind of pissed off. I'm sorry this is being recorded. Somewhat kind of pissed off at what happened yesterday.
Right.
In this station. And I'm still processing that. And it'll probably take some time. So if you hear any antagonistic vocal cords, it's out of that context that I come this morning, kind of broken from the wounds and continuous wounds of this country that was founded on racism to a large extent when they stole the culture and language and women of our indigenous brothers and sisters called Native Americans. So that's me in a nutshell. I'm not going to be long because my voice is fading on me, and I don't even like the way I sound. So I know if I don't like the way I sound, surely you're not going to like the way I sound. So I'm going to have a few comments. So let me get started. Thank you all for being with us. In God, Word, and Wealth, Kara and Cleve Breed examine the normative biblical teachings of work and wealth. Their cases examined through the interpretive lens of evangelicalism, as the Breeds offer examples of normative teaching from the biblical text. There are 3 biblically based principles worth exploring. The first principle requires people in business to work in close collaboration with God and Jesus. The Breeds surmise that this type of biblical connection, interpretation, and collaboration guarantees fulfillment of jobs and work for all people. The second principle suggests that God's triune preference is for self-owned and self-managed work. And the third principle is that the results of work be distributed in an equitable way among those who perform the work, which does not mean equally. Jesus's focus called for Christians today to fully practice these aforementioned principles. To do less is to confirm Christian principles to congregational life and to deny Jesus's call as a relevant savior to the secular world. This dualistic thinking could be a detriment to this principle. The Breeds navigate the biblical terrain of the post-fall, where God instituted certain normative principles for work. The Israelites worked to meet the needs of the people. Yes, all the people. Even in the pre-law phase, certain tendencies are espoused. First, extended family of self-sufficiency derived from this work. Jobs were available for all because God's injunctions were followed. Second, self-owned managed employment characterized the nature of work. Work was performed within the context of the extended family. We see this in the text Jesus called the sons of thunder, the Zebedee boys, out of their fatherly owned business. Third, a relatively equal distribution of the fruits of work occurred among the extended families of Israel, taking account of differences in family size. The Breed suggests that these same principles were applied to the pre-fall in the Garden of Eden. The argument was simply that these same God-given principles were evident in the Mosaic law and the teachings of Jesus. These teachings were meant to govern the organization of work and wealth throughout history. It is interesting that the Breeds offer a helpful table called the Mosaic Law of Work and Wealth, and they suggest 6 instructional elements. The first one, God aimed to generate high levels of prosperity among the Israelites via work, not inheritance. This would be achieved only if all God's spiritual and material requirements were followed. Specific mechanisms, particularly directed to assisting the poor to work, aim to ensure that there were more equal distributions of this prosperity, and it would be achieved throughout or within these mechanisms. These mechanisms sought to ensure that work was available to all able-bodied Israelites and non-Israelites, so there was no discrimination. Number 5, for Israelites, the idea of work was self-owned and self-managed farming, just predicated on the culture that was there. Then number 6, if God's requirements were followed, the wealth of the Israelites overall would increase. The Breeds discussed the criteria of wealth, suggesting that access possessions and a more than enough quality time frame and framework is evident. The lack of a biblical definition is due to the law serving as a means of distributive wealth equity. Jesus comes into ministry and upholds these 3 principles by governing jobs and wealth creation. Work could get in the way of following Jesus. The Breeds write that Jesus emphasized that earthly pursuits, work, family, the pursuits of riches could act as barriers against seeking and serving the kingdom of God. Overall, in Jesus' teaching, the 3 principles for the generation of work and wealth is still obtainable. First, work has to be developed actively with God. Only in this way will enough jobs be generated for everyone. Second, Jesus' preferences tend towards self-owned, self-managed work. Third, inequities in the distribution of wealth are to be reduced via generating more jobs for more people. The Breeds pose a legitimate question. How could Christians help create more self-owned, self-managed jobs than exist currently? Self-employment, partnerships, 100% employee share-owned firms, and worker cooperatives are the most obvious firm types, with some deviation, such as Commonwealth-owned firms. In closing, there seems to be a framework that transcends and transforms the current economic conditions. Priority number 1, everything, including work, is to be done in cooperation with God through Jesus. Work is intended to be an act of love and praise to God, to assist in the redemption of the creation, and to foster harmonious relationships between people in which the Trinity serves as the model. Priority number 2, obedience to God's teachings, reliance on prayer to God, self-management, self-direction, self-ownership, self-control were the features sought by Jesus. To not resurrect these normative principles will continue to keep us in a bind. After reading the article, I had one question, and it was a reflective question. In the midst of racial, cultural, economic pandemics, how do we address the decolonization of wealth in America and also in the church?
Thanks so much, Stephen. Um, yeah, that's a good question. And I hope that's something, we can wrestle with throughout our project here, and something that has to go into our materials, right? And as we continue to wrestle with that. It sounds like that was a really interesting article, and maybe some of you would also like to look into that and add it to your reading list. So thank you again. And
if I could
sure.
ask a quick question, Stephen, would you be willing to share your notes? It looks like you took some notes about this. That looks like a very useful summary for us.
So now you put on your professor hat again on me, and I'm out of school, but yes.
Yeah, that's a great idea, because we're actually collecting, or actually it's Aaron and George and John are working on an annotated bibliography. So that would fit right in. Yeah, that'd be great.
I'll make sure that happens. Thank you.
It was a great summary. Yeah, thank you.
And I know Juan is going to give an introduction to our speaker, but I did want to welcome Dr. Freddie Haynes also personally, and it's great to have you here with us at our time in Dallas. Friendship West and Dr. Freddie Haynes were the people you could count on when it came to worker rights issues, supporting worker issues, supporting labor, supporting unions. And so it's really great to reconnect with you again and hear some of the work that your church is doing and bringing that to Nashville for us to hear. And I know one event that really sticks with me was in Dallas. We started a Labor Day parade. It must have been like 8 years ago or something. Right. And Dr. Haynes was our first speaker. We had about, I think, probably about 100 people, 120 people there, which is big, for labor in Dallas. And people were so impressed to hear a pastor preach in support of worker rights, and he really lit a fire under us. And that's, in already 100-degree heat, he was able to really, light the fire there at this picnic after the march. And it's not, I don't have to tell you, but it's not often that you find, right, pastors with a clear, analysis of the economic situation, who address, economic structures that exploit workers, divide workers, all the things that keep wages depressed, ensure that, workers have as little power as possible in the workplace. So welcome again, and thank you for your work and for speaking with us.
Thank you.
So
I'll hand it over to Juan. Yeah, sorry.
Pass the mic. All right. Thank you
Absolutely.
so much. And Pastor Haynes, thank you so much for getting up on this morning and sharing with us. My heart is overwhelmed with joy right now. And for those of you all who don't know, first of all, you need to know the Reverend Dr. Frederick Douglass Haynes III. He received, and I'm not going to talk out of turn here. I'm going to, speak as quickly as I can to get out the way so you can receive the man in full fashion. But just to understand that when he was called to senior pastoral ministry at Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas in 1983, first of all, they snatched him pretty much out of his cradle. Okay, so just know that for a fact, okay? But since that time, and under his servant leadership, right, the ministry and the membership of that church had grown from just a handful of folk, maybe 100 at best, to well over 12,000, right? Still thriving, still striving, right? beyond and above that, right, Dr. Haynes continued his education from Bishop College, right, that great and phenomenal institution in Dallas, Texas. Graduated there with honors in '82 with a BA in religion and English. Then proceeded as a member of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. Okay, rocking the black and gold. Okay. Represent. Okay. He earned his master's at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in '05, but then went on to receive his doctorate in ministry at the Graduate Theological Foundation at Oxford University. What I found most amazing and remarkable is that his dissertation at that time, right, was about his commitment to faith and social activism, right? I'm gonna put it out there on you, Doc, right? To turn the world upside down, church growth in a church committed to social justice. And oftentimes, especially those of us who've gone through the kind of burning sands of having to think through, much less write a dissertation, oftentimes that feels like a blank check, right? Where you're just like putting it out there and you're hoping somehow you're going to live up to what you put on paper or what you put into the universe. It's my steadfast witness, not only as someone who thinks about and talks about Black church, but actually having the blessing to have had Pastor Haynes as my pastor, as my family's pastor, as well as a great and dear friend. He walks it like he talks it, right? He is a man whose ministry is living up to the bargain that was established in that document all those years ago. And so last but not least, in many forms of his leaderships, and in some of what he'll talk about on this morning, his participation and leadership in ministerial alliances in the greater Dallas-Fort Worth area, his role as a co-founder of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, his willingness to step up and speak up on countless issues of concern, not just for the Black community, but I believe for the nation as a whole, right? Especially in terms of usury and payday loan lending, issues of grave and I think increasingly important concern as we were watching the news in the past weeks and months. Pastor Haynes has been relentless in his pursuit for social justice. And so having said all that, please take it away, Pastor Haynes.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Juan, for your hyperbolic, gracious, loving words of introduction. And I'm just totally honored, Rosemarie, to see you and JR again for your service. You are missed here in Dallas. The Floyd Thomases left Dallas. I need to follow y'all to Nashville because it's like all ends up leaving Dallas and going to Nashville. So you are greatly missed. And Juan Floyd Thomas, Stacey Floyd Thomas, I look up to them. They have fed and informed my ministry and growth. They continue to do that. And for that, I am grateful. Let me just say to both JR and Rosemarie that recently for Labor Day, we of course could not get together because of the pandemic, but they did ask me to speak again this year for what they called a Labor Day gathering that was, again, virtual. So 8 years ago, you started something, and I'm still trying to run with it. So thank you very much. Now, I'm trying to figure out if Juan is still my friend, because to have me go after Dr. Handy ain't fair. Dr. Handy, I thought we were cool, and I'm gonna let Tyrone know that you decided to preach and just killed everything before I could say a word. So if I don't do anything, remember what Dr. Handy said, and we're good, we're good. Now, to be honest, I was so all inspired by both the subject matter and the conversation. I definitely over prepared. I have a video that I'd like to share with you. I'd also like to share some comments that I hope will be helpful because they reflect a testimony of what we have tried to do in our years at Friendship West. I want to, first of all, if you don't mind, just read a passage from the Hebrew Bible, Deuteronomy 24:14, that says, "Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns." Of course, the book of Deuteronomy is seen as a series of sermons. Better still, one may even refer to it as a series of valedictory messages offered by the legendary liberator and lawgiver Moses. And as Moses is espousing or even extrapolating principles for occupying a land of promise and possibility, one of the things that Moses spends some significant time on is how we navigate the economy of the land of promise, how we navigate social economy in the land of promise. And so in that 14th verse, one more time, "Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns." I have been greatly blessed, as Dr. Juan Floyd Thomas can tell you, with God just putting in my pathway persons who have invested inspiration and influence in my spirit. I won't forget early in my ministry, I think it was in the early 90s, I was invited to preach at the last minute for Dr. Jeremiah Wright Jr. Because Dr. Charles Adams of Detroit, Hartford Memorial Baptist Church, could not make the engagement. He was preaching a revival with Dr. James Forbes at Trinity United Church of Christ, again, pastored at that time by Dr. Jeremiah Wright. Dr. Adams could not make a Saturday evening service, and so Dr. Wright asked me if I would fly in, preach that Saturday evening, and then fly back to Dallas in time for my Sunday morning services. I said, okay, flew up to Chicago, arrived at the church, and after church was over, I rode back in the car with Dr. James Forbes. Dr. Forbes was already a homiletical hero, but that conversation began to make me take another look at expanding my concept of ministry. I had already come to understand the need for feeding the hungry, clothing the naked. I had come to understand the need for reaching out to those who were locked behind prison doors. But I had not come to a full understanding of the concept of the work of justice, the concept of economic justice. And at that moment, Dr. Forbes and I, we were engaged in conversation. One may well call it a ride-along theology, where he's just dropping these pearls of wisdom, these amazing bombs of theological and even hermeneutical knowledge. I won't forget this as long as I live, because one of the things he said, and he later wrote about this in his book entitled Whose Gospel. He talks about in Whose Gospel, and he shared it with me, again, back in the early 90s, the story of when he was growing up. He grew up in a big family, and in this big family, his mother had a ritual when they got ready to sit down at the dinner table to eat, and they would add extra leaves into the table to expand it, so that even guests from the community, friends that he had, could come and share in dining at the table of his wonderful mother. And he said that his mother engaged in this ritual. I share it with you because it becomes the illustrative basis for what I hope to share this day. The ritual that she performed every single time they'd gather around the table, and the first question she would raise would be, "Are all the children here? Are all the children here?" At that moment, again, grace has not been said, but she wants to know, before we begin our process of saying grace and then eating food are all the children here. And at that moment, everyone who knew what child was missing had the responsibility of speaking up. Dr. Forbes said they were indoctrinated to speak up if someone was missing from the meal, if someone was missing from the table of opportunity. It was obligated on those who were at the table to speak up for the child who was missing from the table. Don't forget that. I'm gonna come back and grab that. And then once they spoke up, they would say grace. After saying grace, the food could not be consumed until those who had recognized that a child was missing from the family table would make a plate for the ones who were missing, and then put that plate in the wood burning stove. And that way the food was kept for the ones who were missing from the family table. And so Dr. Forbes, then again, we're riding from the church back to the hotel, and the illustration is already pregnant with so many principles that are just speaking to my spirit. And Dr. Forbes said to me, that is where America has often failed. We have failed to recognize that all of us have a responsibility to make sure that everyone is at the table of economic opportunity, that everyone is at the table. And when there are those we recognize as having not made it to the table, we have a responsibility not only to add leaves to the table, but which in essence is what? Checking to ensure that the structure is prepared for others to come to the table. But not only must the structure be prepared, but someone has a responsibility for speaking up for those who have no voice. Someone has a responsibility for speaking up and saying, these people, this person is not at the table. This child is missing from the table. And then after you have benefited from, here it is, the act of grace. Grace was said, do not, recognizing that you've been blessed by grace, do not get your food, but you make sure that some food that is prepared and that you put in the oven so the food is kept warm for those who find themselves not yet at the table. So I open up with both that text from the Hebrew Bible as well as that illustration from the life of Dr. James Forbes, because that conversation, Dr. Juan, that conversation caused me to rethink, what am I doing as it relates to ministry? It's not enough just to feed the hungry. It's not enough just to clothe those who are naked. We've got to make sure that at the table of America, the American economy, we've got to make sure there are enough leaves in the structure so that all can get to the table. We have a responsibility to make sure that those who are not at the table, that we speak up for them. And when we speak up for them, we have a responsibility, knowing we have benefited from grace, to ensure that they have a meal. So that really kind of speaks to the work that we have tried to do. I'll share some highlights from that. I won't forget, as long as I live, about 10 years ago now, I came home from vacation and I was driving to the church, and on the corner of Hampton and Wheatland Road, there was a payday loan store. And I am blown away by the fact that there's a payday loan store that had replaced what had been a nursery, where of course you have plants and flowers. And so I had left at the beginning of the month, it's middle of the month, and in less than 15 days, what had been a nursery that nurtured plants is now a payday loan store. I didn't know what a payday loan store at the time was. Unfortunately, I called my pastor of Justice, Danielle Ayers. I said, what is a payday loan store? And so she explained to me that basically a payday loan store is what? it's legalized loan sharking, where these institutions, these stores pop up in communities that are characterized by being underbanked. They are underserved, and I'm just tripping. I'm blown away. I then call a community meeting to come to the church of the neighborhood associations in the area, ask them about the Payday Loan Store, and the testimonies blow my mind, because they start sharing that payday loan stores are proliferating in our community, in a community where we have some 6 or 7 mega churches in a 5-mile radius. I don't want you to miss this. In a 5-mile radius of some 6 or 7 mega churches, we had 22 payday loan or car title loan stores. That made me do some more research, because I'm discovering that some payday loan stores had replaced restaurants. One payday loan store had replaced a bank branch. And of course, the metaphor right there is powerful. What was a bank branch is now a payday loan store. What was a restaurant, y'all are too young to know about this, a Steak and Ale restaurant, it's now a car title loan store. And the more research I did, the more I discovered that in Texas alone, and please don't miss this, we have more, to this day, we have more payday and car title loan stores than we have McDonald's, Burger King, and Dairy Queen stores combined. And so that gives you an idea of the economy that targets communities that are already suffering from economic neglect. And that says, when you look at the table, at the structure, sadly, shamefully, I'll even say economically sinfully, there are those who cannot get to the table because of woven into the structure are underbanked, underserved communities, and those underbanked and underserved communities preclude persons from getting to the table because they are saddled with payday loans. I'll give you this in case you're not familiar with a payday loan can run anywhere from an interest rate of 300 to, I saw one loan that a person in the community shared with me, a loan that she had gotten, and the interest rate was 922%. 922%. I'll say that one more time, 922%. A payday loan. It's a small dollar loan, but the idea is that you never really are able to pay it off because of the fact they have access to your bank account, they have access to your resources, and what they do, they take it out of your account as you were doing everything you can to pay it off. And so what ends up happening is when you can't pay it off, then you have to take out another loan. And when you can't pay that one off, you take out another loan. And so it happens where persons end up taking out loans some 7, 8, 9 times. And this became, I'll be honest with you, the more I learned of how insidious and not just that, but how voracious this industry is, it became just downright irritating. And so I tried to organize some pastors in the community of these mega churches. I said, listen, we need to exert our influence to make a difference at this time. And so that's what we tried to do. I ended up going to Austin and engaging in conversation with then Governor Rick Perry. I won't go into all of that conversation. It was interesting to say the least. But again, I'm having flashbacks, forgive me. And then I testified before the Senate Financial Services Committee there in Austin. And that testimony led, Maxine Waters, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, heard about it, and she asked me to come to Washington, D.C., and I shared a similar testimony before the House Financial Services Committee there in Washington, D.C. What has become of our work, 2 things. Number one, we were able to pass because Texas is what they call a red state. And one of the things we discovered when we went to Austin, and because we'd gone to Austin to again fight the industry, only to discover that there were at least 3 persons in the House, 1 in the Senate, who owned payday loan stores. Needless to say, we did not make much headway in our fight against the payday loan industry on a state level. On the local level here in Dallas, the good news is we were able to pass the most severe zoning regulations in the country on payday loans and on payday loan stores. And so as a consequence, the payday loan industry, they sued the city of Dallas. Other cities have taken the Dallas model across the state of Texas because, again, we can't win at the state level right now. That will only take place as elections come and go. But the good news is the zoning regulations have been so severe, they have limited what the payday industry can do. And so that is one piece as it relates to justice, addressing what? The leaves in the structure. The other thing we had to do, the moment we began to fight the industry, I've got to be real with you, we were attacked by people in our own community who were saying, all right, Pastor Haynes, so here you go attacking the payday loan industry, but we can't get a loan at a bank. We can't get access to a small dollar loan. So you have become our enemy. And I did not plan on becoming the enemy of our people. And so I said, okay, what can I do? About that time, as God would have it, Muhammad, I believe his last name is pronounced Yunus. He won the Nobel Peace Prize over in India for what he was doing around what is called micro lending or micro loans. And these are small dollar loans, low interest rate loans for persons who don't have access, again, to banking. And he won a Nobel Peace Prize. I did my research. I said, we're going to start a micro loan bank at Friendship West. Now, I have no background in this, zero. I just read this in the newspaper and decided we're going to start a micro loan at Friendship West. And I get up on Sunday, I said, listen, Muhammad has started this in India. We are going to do micro loans. I want special offerings I'm taking up special offerings from micro loans. And thank God, my members are just so wonderful. They just believe that I know what I'm talking about. And when I tell you, we raised in excess of $250,000. And finally, someone came to me and said, Pastor Haynes, do you know how to even operate a microloan? I said, no, I don't, because you can't operate it out of the church. I said, are you sure? They said, unless you want to get in some severe trouble. And so I said, okay, what do I do? Well, you need to get under the umbrella of another institution, especially a credit union. And so I said, we don't have one. Let's start one. And didn't know that requires quite a process. As God would have it, the church I was a member of while I was in college, St. John Baptist Church, it was pastored by Manuel Scott at the time when I was in college. And at this time, the credit union, when we were raising money for the micro loan fund, they were basically going out of business, and they had a federal charter, which I came to understand is very difficult to get. And so they said, listen, y'all got the money and you got numbers of members. We have a federal charter. Can we come together and marry our efforts? And so I said, okay, because I just heard that I need a federal credit union in order to operate this micro loan fund. And so fortunately, long story short, that came together. And when that came together, we now have what is called the Faith Cooperative Federal Credit Union that operates on our campus there at Friendship West. And as a part of the services of that federal credit union, we do micro loans. And let me just say that we have dispensed over 500 small dollar loans, and only one, now I want to say this, only one of the loans were defaulted on. In that they never did pay it back. And so we're very proud of that. We feel like we're trying to get the children to the table. We're also trying to make sure we save meals in the oven for those who were not at the table, and it's a part of our story. I want to just share one more story that may be an introduction. If we have time to show the video, I would like to show the video. If we don't, I do understand. I'll just say real briefly that Dr. Zan Wesley Holmes Jr., Rosemarie, I know you know that name. Dr. Zan, the man, became the president of the African American Pastors Coalition. We organized that coalition to break out of an interdenominational body that was quite conservative. And we wanted a prophetic witness, a social justice activist kind of pastors organization. And so we asked Dr. Holmes to lead the organization. And one of the projects that we are most proud of is that we were able to put together our resources with community resources, and in a community that had zero construction, we were able to come up, and Dr. Juan was a part of our church family during this time with Unity Estates, where we built homes, an organization of pastors built homes, middle income homes. And the streets now have as their names the names of the churches that invested in this area. And Friendship West shortly thereafter moved to that same area. We were already planning on moving to that area. And then again, here's the powerful piece. We're expanding the leaves at the table. We ensured that economic development took place around all of that. And so there's a mall now that is right down the street that was not there before. I mean, it's a completely new area that you can see on the video. So that is some of what we are trying to do. One of the things that, and I close with this, that has come to bother me increasingly is to discover that I'm in a state that is anti-labor, a state that fights labor, a state that is anti-workers' rights. And so our church has, with intentionality, try to always side with and provide resources for workers by way of our influence. Even when I think it was at the beginning of last year, when that abominable experience happened where the government was shut down. And so you have the government shut down. And so we organized and we were a part of a big rally downtown. And then what we were able to do, because again, they weren't getting paid. And that Sunday, I asked the church family, I said, listen, we're going to be mega, let's act mega. I want to take up an offering right now that we're going to give to workers who are not getting a check. Because of the fact that the government has been sadly shut down and they're not receiving work. And so we took up an offering and we passed out that money for those who were experiencing, again, not having a seat at the table because of the government shutdown. So I'll stop right there. I promise you I got a whole lot more material to go, but I don't want to put you to sleep this early because I did see you're tired and I don't want to add to the fatigue and you end up saying, I'm tired of him talking.
No.
Oh, no, definitely not. Yeah, we're awake. Yeah. Well, thank you for telling your story. And maybe Aaron wants to take over facilitation, but maybe now's a good time too to see if the group has some questions and kind of move the conversation that way.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So why don't we just, let's open up the floor. Are there responses, questions that we have? Our plate is now full. We've got a lot to feast on here from what Dr. Haynes has given us. So let's think together a little bit and cherish this opportunity here. George.
George.
I think Vonda in the chat actually recommended that there might be a way that we see the video. Is that possible?
So yes, I just want to make sure the video that I have was the one that I received earlier, which is a much longer one, and I want to make sure that that's the right video that you're referencing here. Is that correct?
I believe, is that it, Dr. Juan?
That's the one that you sent me.
Right, right. And listen, you don't have to show all of it. So it is good.
That's great.
I'm interviewing in the video, just to give you some I guess a preview of coming attractions. Number one, I'm interviewing Dr. Zan Wesley Holmes Jr., and he tells the story of how we were able to, as a coalition of churches and pastors, build Unity Estates. If you want to see that part, or you have in that video also our pastor of social justice, Pastor Danielle Ayers. And Pastor Ayers talks about the work that we are doing around the payday industry, our fight against the payday loan industry, and just the justice work and the economics of the justice work. So you can, look at both or one or the other. It's up to you. Yeah.
So this is great. What we can do is I can share my screen right now. I've got it pulled up, and we can watch, say, the first 5 minutes. What's wonderful. Go for it, York. Yeah.
Let me suggest, though, I mean, it's just a matter of time while we have Dr. Haynes with us. Maybe, the video could be shared. I mean, we already have the link. So, I mean, even 5 minutes would take away from our opportunity to engage.
That's right. I was just about to say the next person that we have on our schedule is Dr. Floyd Thomas. So I think this is right. Let's take advantage of the conversation now with Dr. Haynes, and maybe if the group, has a desire to watch some of the video, we can. I also just shared it in the chat, so we've got it available, and we can even schedule a time where we can all convene and watch it together. It's something that we can definitely make available. This is true. But I like the idea of wanting to kind of cherish this opportunity for a conversation with Dr. Haynes now. Are there questions? Dr. Floyd Thomas, looks like do you have a hand up?
Yeah. First of all, I'm like I said at the top, I'm ready, willing, and able to yield time, because when you've got something as great as this going on, you don't want to stop the hustle. So let me just say that first. I'm willing to sacrifice. But more importantly, and I wanted to not blow past something that Pastor Haynes has been offering up, which is how the origin, right? Because Doc, you've rightfully lifted up Danielle Ayers as your social justice minister, but talk about the theological vision that allowed for a position like that to even be part of the makeup of the church. That would be, I think, interesting and important. Also, I wanted to talk about Unity Estates and the broader vision that Youth and Friendship West have had in terms of reimagining Oak Cliff as a space where you could have that kind of redevelopment and reinvestment that didn't, and I emphasize this, that didn't emphasize gentrification.
Right.
As the vision or the model for this happening.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. First, in terms of the vision of having a social justice pastor, I have to admit that we were, developing our social justice vision, and I was invited to preach for Dr. Frank Thomas when he was in Matson, Illinois, and I pulled up to his parking lot, and there's a parking space reserved for the pastor of justice. And so I said, the pastor of justice, this is interesting. And so I asked him about it. He said, yeah. He said, after all, what you prioritize is reflected in what you budget. And so if you're going to have a pastor of youth because you emphasize, you have a love for youth, then you have a pastor of justice because you emphasize, have a pastor of justice. And so I immediately, believing that it's all right to be a copycat if you copy the right cat, I said, I'm gonna copy this cat, and ran back to Friendship West and said, we have to have a pastor of justice. I didn't even ask him what the job description was. I said, we're gonna draw up a job description based on the need we have here in Dallas, and we're going to see what God does with that. And out of that, Dr. Wan, thank you for that. We came up with a vision for our community. One of the things that I challenge now all of us to do, and it really challenged my colleagues here in Dallas, and that is to stop just having a vision for your church. In the 90s, it was real hot. Church growth, you got to have a vision for your church, a vision for your church. And where there is no vision, the people perish. And yet, when you read those passages that talk about vision, they weren't talking about a church facility. They were talking about a nation, a community. And so the question is, do people of faith have a vision for what the community, for what the city should look like? And that became for me a burden, because in Dallas, just as in most cities, you have a power structure that basically has planned out what the city will look like 30, 40 years down the road, and we spend our time reacting to their long-term plan as opposed to casting, creating, and mobilizing around a vision, because we have reimagined what we want our community to look like. And so you're talking about a community. Those of you who are familiar with hip hop know that one of the songs out of Dallas is Oak Cliff. That's my hood. And I won't get into the rest of it, but I pastor in Oak Cliff, and Oak Cliff is straight hood. And because of that, when I talk about hood, I talk about it not in the positive sense of the word, because there are positives associated with that, but in the negative sense, in that you're talking about a community that is south of downtown. And the city manager recently shared with the city of Dallas that we make up 52% of the land mass, but only 15% of the land value of the city of Dallas. I think that's very important to understand. 52% of the land mass, but then 15%, 1/5 of the land value. One reason is because we have 29 landfills on our side of town. One of those landfills that has become notorious, and we helped to make it notorious, is called Shingle Mountain. There is, and just hear this. Shingle Mountain, 29 landfills, payday car title loan stores that target our side of town. What kind of economic and community development can you have when you have landfills and payday and car title loan stores predominating or being predominant as to what happens by way of an economy on that side of town? And so one of the things I've discovered, that if we're going to fight and create the kind of community we want, we must incorporate environmental justice in our fight. And I'll get back to that, because I want to go back to, I got too hyped about that. And so the whole concept around the pastor of justice is I share with the church. We have a pastor of youth, pastor of children, pastor of Christian education. We need a pastor of social justice, because we do justice work. We need to invest in justice work, and we need to ensure that we have someone who gives leadership. And so Danielle Ayers was secured as our pastor of social justice. She has a calling on her life for this work, and I'm grateful to God for that. I must also say that we came across some real challenges in that, because there were those who said, okay, we have a pastor of justice now, so we'll let her do the justice work. We got a pastor of justice. We don't have to do it ourselves. We have her to do it. And that was a real challenge early on, because the mindset was, okay, we're a justice church, but we have a justice pastor now. So the justice pastor can represent us in all of those areas. And so we had to grow out of that and teach out of that, that no, this is something that is not just a Danielle Ayers piece or a Pastor Haynes piece. This is a Friendship West ministry. It's what we do as a church family. And so now I'm glad to say that we totally restructured our staff. And as a consequence, justice is a part of our identity, our mission, our vision as a church. Our vision statement is, Friendship West will be a game-changing Christian community that connects people to Jesus, fights for justice while creating the beloved community. So it's become a part of our DNA now, as opposed to just a Pastor Haynes or just a Danielle Ayers piece. But to the last part of your question, Dr. Juan, one of the things that happened that hit me real hard, again, anecdote, but it's a part of our testimony. In the 90s, we were located on Keys Boulevard. And most people don't know this because Dallas is so image conscious that it always buries any negative news. But in the 90s, Dallas had a reputation as it relates to murders that Chicago has right now. 1995, we had over 500 murders in Dallas. And again, I think you would know most would happen on our side of town. And so we began to really get engaged in this work. And it was simultaneous to me preaching at Trinity and having the conversation with Dr. Forbes. We had a revival later that year. Pastor Jeffrey Johnson is preaching, and we come out of service on a Monday night, and across the street, there is this crime scene that is, taped off, yellow tape, a crime scene, and it's right across the street, which is juxtaposed to our parking lot. And it's at this apartment complex. And I'm just like, okay, we just had church, and while we're having church, some kind of horrible activity had taken place. I found out the next day that 3 young African-American men had been tied up, placed in a bathtub, and had been shot in the head and killed while we were having church. Now, I'll just say this. Personally, I'm offended because I'm like, we're the light of the world, and this darkness is going on right across the street while we are having church. There's something inept, impotent about our church witness if we can be praising the God of heaven and 3 young Black men get killed across the street while we are having church. There was something about that I was just offended by. I could not take it. And so as a consequence, we began to organize our church. That following Saturday, we had a silent march of all of our men who were dressed in black. We put in front of the church this casket that was open. In the casket was a mirror. And because we were trying to make a statement, we marched silently through the community, got back to the church, sisters met us, and then we dispersed into the community, surveying the community because the community now is upset. And we decided that we would find out what the needs were. Later that week on a Thursday night, I invited every elected representative, our city council person, our state rep, our state senator, our county commissioner, our congressperson to meet me at 10 o'clock at night to walk the streets so they could see what's going on at 10 o'clock at night on a Thursday night. And out of that, a lot of good stuff happened. But one of the things that, I came to discover is that we were an economically neglected community, and that economically neglected community created a recipe, as it were, for criminal activity. And we did all we could to not only deal with the criminal aspect of it, but to organize the people. I didn't know I was a community organizer, but that's what they called me back then, because we became the headquarters for the neighborhood association there on Keast. And not only did we become the headquarters, but we fought to make sure that area was invested in with resources. We back then were reimagining public safety because we shared with them. We did something that we thought was good at first. We became the largest and the first class out of the Dallas Police Department to be trained for what they call volunteers in patrol. Our men patrolled the streets on the weekend of the community. And what we discovered is that the crime moved. It didn't stop, it just moved. And so that's when I went back to the city and said, we're not going to do this anymore. What we need to know is, are you going to help us understand that public safety begins with opportunity? You're talking about a job desert, a business desert. And until we create jobs in the summer for young people, until we create an opportunity for business development, we're not going to have public safety in this community. And so out of that, we were able to do a business a business development center and a job creation center right there in that community. And the crime rate drastically went down. The murder rate drastically went down. And I don't take full credit for it because it was a partnership with the neighborhood association, other churches in the area, but it had everything to do with recognizing that public safety cannot be limited to just policing us, because when you police us and over police us, you get Breonna Taylor. And but when you create opportunity then has a way of making the community what it should be. And one of the things that happened out of that, Dr. Juan, that I am still excited about to this day is that community housed at Friendship West developed a vision and a strategic plan for bringing that vision to pass. And to this day, they still meet at our former site that we now call the Frederick Douglass Human Services and Social Justice Center, because again, you're not going to have a healthy community if you do not create opportunities for that community. And that community has something to do with creating the vision, casting the vision, and then mobilizing to bring the vision to pass.
That was wonderful. Thank you for that rich response to this really insightful question too. I just want to, we're keeping track of things on the chat here. So friends, if you've got questions, please just type in STACK and we'll get a list going. I want to make sure that we respect Dr. Haynes' time, but from what I understand, we're still okay. So correct me if I'm wrong. So wonderful, good. Well, great. So that we've got three that are in line here. I wonder if we can just turn to Ellen and to Rosemary and Jorg. Did I get that order right? I had it in the chat. So why don't we?
Wanda also, maybe we can take them all.
Yes. Okay. Then let's do that. Let's go to Ellen. Do you want to start it off?
Sure.
And we'll just we'll give them to Dr. Haynes here.
Okay. Thank you for giving me a chance to ask a question, because what you were just talking to leads perfectly into my question. And forgive me, but I am not in the church. I am not a pastor. Dr. Haynes, for your reference, I'm the executive director of a small organization here in Nashville that creates job opportunities for people who experience barriers to traditional income. So people that are previously incarcerated, struggling with homelessness, coming out of addiction. We create small businesses specifically to employ that group of people. Awesome. So my question, as I'm sitting here listening to all the wonderful things you've been able to accomplish, and maybe this is for the greater group as well, I just feel like so often we operate in a bubble, and I want to know where the synergy is in Nashville with the churches that I, as an executive director, should be talking to, because we have a really great mission and we have a really narrow mission. And so we love to partner with people so that we don't mission creep. We partner with people that can provide social services for our employees. We partner with people that can navigate unemployment with our our employees, because we don't have the staff or the resources to do that well. So I want to know where the synergy is in Nashville right now that I'm missing. And if it's not there, how did you create that? Like, who's leading the charge? Like, how can we do a better job of just creating that? Because you've done a wonderful job, Dr. Haynes, but I know you didn't do it alone, as you've said. So how did you create that synergy? Thank you.
And thank you. Not only thank you for the question, but thank you for what you're doing, because it's so vital. And I've been just blessed with some amazing grace, because again, with the whole payday loan fight, I just happened to see this payday loan store down the street from our church, and I'm ashamed of myself because I did not know that they were popping up in our community, and it did not hit me until it hit me, which again, I apologize to our community repeatedly for that. And then once my eyes were open to this problem, I tried to host this community meeting, and out of the community meeting, then synergy just kind of, popped up, with answers here and answers there, because I think you're right. It's very important that, all of us understand that none of us by ourselves can get the work done. We've been blessed, to create coalitions, to be invited into coalitions. And that for me has been our saving grace, because when you get invited into coalitions, or you're able to create a coalition, those coalitions oftentimes create resources, and then you can connect dots. And so I'll go back to, again, the piece we did with Unity Estates and Dr. Zan Wesley Holmes Jr. We're a group of pastors. We have no knowledge whatsoever as it relates to building homes. We can't build housing ourselves, but we know that our community is in desperate need of some nice housing. And so we just ended up making announcements. We went back to our churches and decided this Sunday, the only announcement our churches will make in our churches from the pulpit will have to do with, how we can, build a community of homes. And it was interesting that, all of us went back and made these announcements, and not out of the churches, but out of the connections of members in the churches, we were connected with people, not a part of our organization. And they said, listen, this is what you have to do. This resource here, this resource there. And before we knew it, all the pieces started lining up. And then we had a person that we who was a member of St. Luke, I believe it was, and another person who was a pastor of another church, Richie Butler, who just does this kind of work. And all of that just started coming together. So I think it's important for us to take advantage of public spaces to raise questions as to who is doing what. And when we do that, we have an opportunity to find out that there are some hidden treasures in our community just waiting to be asked. And that has been our testimony, because I promise you, we've done none of this without coalescing with others. And then once that happens, you almost get a reputation, and people know, well, we can count on so-and-so when it comes to this. And so I didn't know that, for example, Texas was so strongly anti-labor. And then, this amazing, couple comes to my office and they say, we need you involved in this work. And I'm like, I'm down, because I grew up in San Francisco and we have strong unions there. I was in a union when I was a college student, and I couldn't believe how much money I made, as a college student because of my union connection. And so to get to Texas and discover, okay, you don't have those same opportunities. And I didn't know that until, this amazing couple came in and shared that with me. So that's a long answer to your short question. But coalitions without question. You have to reach out. And I've discovered that those who are already doing the work are going to be down for doing the work.
Thank you for that. That's a really wonderful question. Ellen, I also want to point out too that some of our own members, I think this group is a sort of is a focal point of Synergy, because Stephen Handy is, his church is already starting things. You've got Vonda here. I mean, so you've already got the CLC, and you've got churches here, and you've got the Div School. So this is, so it's almost sort of the answer to your question is bubbling up. But it's really important to connect that vision of whatever the organization of the church to the community, right? So that's part of what George and John and I will also be researching, is providing us with a database of what churches are doing things and how is it that we can deeper connect that. We've got Rosemary, Jorg, and Vonda. Just a sense on time, it sounds like just in the chat here on the back end, it sounds like we'll begin with Dr. Floyd Thomas at 10:30. How does that? And so we've got about another 15 minutes. Is that okay? So we'll do that. Rosemary, Jorg, and Vonda are in the stack here.
Okay, well, thank you again, Dr. Haynes, for your presentation and to hear about all the deep work you're doing. And my question kind of piggybacks off of Ellen's. And so in this work, I love that you came to see the cooperative solution, like just kind of organically, and put together this coalition of pastors and your can-do spirit. Like, we don't know how to do this, we see the need, and we can find people who can help us do this work. And I appreciate that you have this economic analysis that, especially around the banking issue and the payday lending, that, you see that, if we control the banks, right, if we control the financing, then we can make it affordable, make it useful for folks. And that's what we want, right? We want people to flourish, and the banks and these structures should be there to support this. So my question is, part of our, and it's related to part of our project being that we want to create materials for churches to understand, how we can shift the economy to make it an economy for all and not just for the 1%. So can you tell us more about how you talk to your congregation about this, and what are the challenges that come up, and how you overcome these kind of practical, like how do you address these questions around economics with your church, and the responses, and how you then push back against the pushback?
Right. Well,
And maybe my question actually directly follows up on Rosemary. So let me tag it on. So
okay.
to save you some time in the response. Well, thanks so much, first of all, for presenting this morning, Freddie. It's great to see you again. Zane Holmes was my office neighbor at Perkins School of Theology for many years. So he and I are also very close, and it's just wonderful work. My quick question here, and sort of tagging on to Rosemary, would be pedagogical. How do you help your church members that realize that charging 922% of interest is actually fraud and horrible? I think that's something that people can see, but how do you take them from there, to marching with the labor movement, building co-ops? I mean, that's sort of behind also, what's your pedagogy? How do you motivate people for that?
Thank you. And I really appreciate that. And it's so good to see, again, both of you. I will say this, for me, I do all I can to continuously expose our members to the kind of, pedagogy that sides with or sees scripture from the bottom up and not from the top down. One of the things that Jerome Ross, brilliant biblical scholar, says, he says, all of scripture, when you put it in its context, the audiences that were recipients of the scripture lived in the context of oppression, one of six, either Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Grecian, or Roman. And so what did that oppressive context look like that the recipients of the sacred text live in? And once you get that, then you recognize if you take the text out of context, that becomes a pretext that ends up conning people. And so for me, it's very important to keep the biblical text in context. And in so doing, I'm viewing scripture now, not from the top down as a, that's been co-opted by what I call empire theology or the hermeneutic of the empire that emphasizes what? Personal piety while ignoring social responsibility. One person who majors in this is John MacArthur. John MacArthur, of course, says that, if you are engaged in the fight for social justice as a Christian or you preach it, you're a heretic. And his whole thing is that the world is to be left to its devices. Our only responsibility is to save souls for heaven. That's his hermeneutic, but it's also a hermeneutic that conveniently is going to be what he calls pro-life. But that pro-life stance is going to be limited to my rights as long as I'm in my mother's womb. But it also violates the rights of a woman to determine what she does with her body. Because again, he has a limited hermeneutic that is co-opted by the empire, because you're not going to challenge the empire. And so I feel I have a responsibility to both teach and preach and expose my congregation and community to what I call a bottom-up theology, a bottom-up hermeneutic that witnesses scripture not from the top down, but from the bottom up. And in so doing, I recognize that scripture and my faith unite in holy wedlock, the spiritual and the social. As William Augustus Jones Jr. used to say, salvation and liberation are connecting links on the gospel chain. And so I cannot ignore, I won't forget this, JR, I cannot ignore when you do the bottom up contextual viewing of scripture. Zan Holmes, in one of his books, he makes it so plain, because I used to believe when I read Jesus in Matthew 25, in the judgment scene, he says, I'm going to separate the, sheep from the goats, and say, I was hungry, I was thirsty, etc., etc. And Dr. Holmes said, when you go back to that text, Jesus is saying in the judgment, I'm going to separate the nations, and then say to the nations, I was hungry and you did not feed me, thirsty, you gave me no water, in prison, and you did not visit me, a stranger, and you did not welcome me in. And so Zan Holmes then interprets that as saying, how does Jesus judge nations? All my life, I've been taught that that's going to be a personal thing. I'm supposed to personally feed the hungry, personally clothe the naked, etc. And Zan Holmes says, no, that has to do with public policy. Nations, through their policies, either feed the hungry or neglect the hungry. Either give water to the thirsty or contaminate water, like as was done in Flint, Michigan. You either open your borders by saying, give me your tired, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, or you build a wall and you snatch children from their parents. And so that kind of pedagogy for me means I've got to put the text in their context and even look afresh at text. And when the text says Jesus is separating the nations, nations then through their policies can either be guilty of not feeding, or they can find themselves exonerated. They can find themselves receiving the good news of welcome because through their policies, they are doing the work that makes a difference. And so it's that kind of thing. And I'll even go here because, again, I can't thank you all enough for coming to my office and getting me engaged in this labor movement, because I could not sit on the sidelines once I found out, and I've had to preach it, that there are certain institutions, all they do is exploit their labor. And some of our communities are addicted to these institutions. And I'll call the name of one, Walmart. Walmart is notorious for mistreating their workers. And so we did all we could to make sure that Walmart was given a bad name. And we did that again through a pedagogy that, I read from Deuteronomy, the Hebrew Bible, and what Moses is saying. You cannot exploit workers. And so my message that in a series of sermons had to do with, if you're not supposed to exploit workers, then you're not supposed to be complicit in the exploitation of those workers just because you may benefit personally from lower prices. Those lower prices cost the workers who are working at that particular for that particular institution. So for me, it's continuing, and I have a friend of mine who he jokes about it. He says, man, Freddie is so into social justice that even if he's preaching about baptism, he's gonna find a way to bring justice into it. And I have to be honest with you, he's probably right, because I have not I don't recall preaching a sermon in the last 20 years without somewhere, finding a way to lift up the justice, the social justice responsibilities and implications of a given text, because I just find that to be the heart of what I'm called to do and the heart of our ministry. And that informs, again, the pedagogy, so that we want that to play out in the lives of our members.
Thank you for that. Maybe we have time to get Vonda's question in here.
I'll try to make my question as short as possible, Aaron. Thank you, Reverend Haynes, for your for the talk today. You shared with us here at my church, First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill, on the 150th anniversary.
Right.
And so I'm glad to be able to be in this space with you again. I wanted to go back to one of the pieces that you talked about around equitable development. In terms of neighborhoods, one of the things that we have experienced here in Nashville over the course of the last 20 years is natural disasters, which have displaced folks in communities.
Yeah.
We had one that went through North Nashville most recently. And so trying to hold the economies of those neighborhoods together, keep the natives of those neighborhoods in place becomes very difficult.
Right.
How have you interacted in terms of with local governments to try to make sure that you are able to keep the neighborhoods in place, keep jobs coming to those neighborhoods? I just wonder from a, faith perspective, how the faith community has interacted with government in terms of policy and vision for communities.
Right. Thank you for that question. And that reminds me, I did not completely answer Dr. Wan's question earlier in terms of the gentrification piece, because I hear that in your question. And so 2 things. Number one, it was very important to me, and I reiterate this, that we create and cast a vision for our community that is the community's vision, not mine, but the community's vision. And that we not only have the community create and cast vision, but then we basically brought in our representatives from councilperson, every representative, congressperson, state rep, state senate rep, and say, okay, this is our vision for what we want in our community. And we do not want to look up and we're no longer here. We want this to happen with us. It's not going to happen for us, because if it happens for us, then that will eliminate us. And so, and I'll give you, I mean, the best example I have is that there's a mall here that I'm sure my favorite couple is aware of here, called Redbird Mall. And Redbird Mall back in the day was a thriving mall, and then it went through a real rough time. And about 4 years ago, wonderful white brother from out north heard about it, and he decided he wanted to redevelop the mall. And I want to say this gently, he was told that you're not going to develop this mall if you don't have a conversation with Pastor Haynes. And so I was not going to have the conversation by myself. I brought in, community activists. And so we met with him. And so our whole thing was, we don't want this to be a gentrified mall. We don't want the mall, because once you redo the mall and the process is started, then property taxes will go up, and we won't be able to afford the community that we have lived in. And I'm not going to go with that. And so we had to take him through an educational process, because he said, well, I think gentrification is a good thing. And so I said, that's a top-down statement. From your vantage point, it's a good thing. From the vantage point of those who used to live in Harlem, who used to live in San Francisco, who used to live, and I call the roll of other cities. And I said, we don't want that to happen. I said, you have a chance to partner with us to show the rest of the nation what it looks like to redevelop a community without removing the traditional residents of that community. And so there are things that we have agreed upon. And we agreed upon them in the presence of our elected officials. Number one, we want to freeze property taxes for the traditional residents. And so we put that in place, and we were able to do that with his influence on those who live on his side of town. And so there's a freezing of the property taxes that is going to preclude, that negative effect of gentrification from going on. The second piece was, and that is, okay, we need business development. So you're going to do all of this reconstructing, renovating of the mall. We want to make sure that Black, brown businesses come out of this. I said the best thing you can do for us is to make sure that new businesses are targeted for development, and then businesses that have been historically neglected, under-resourced, that they have an opportunity. That's going to create jobs. And then we had to make a pact with those who were going to, have their businesses targeted for resources and development. All right, now who are you going to hire? And so we kind of have a what I call a good cycle of development that is going on right now. And it's, I'll be honest with you, it's tenuous because, again, you have a lot of money that's involved and a lot of people who are not pleased. But for me, the top two things are to make sure that our elected officials get on board with, if you're going to do development, okay, we got to freeze property taxes on traditional residents. And then number two, we have a responsibility to invest in the business development and job creation for those who have lived in a community that has been historically neglected. So far, it's working slowly, but it is working. And I think some good things are going to come out of it. But again, it's tenuous because you have a lot of people who don't like what it is we've tried to do.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you, Dr. Haynes, for your time. You've given us so much to think about and so many wonderful, rich examples that are really important and helpful to take it away from the theory down to the concrete, real lived experience, which is so important. So thank you again for your time. I know that you've tracked in the chat too. We did have a request from Pastor Handy for that description of the justice minister. So we'll follow up with you on that. So thank you again for that.
I'll get it to you.
Wonderful. Again, thank you. And we'll give you a round of applause here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to see you.
Someday I would love to hear the story of your vest.
Oh.
I have a feeling it has nothing to do with what we've talked about today, but I just think it's a beautiful vest that you have on.
Yes.
Dr. Handy.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I got this last year in Ghana. Thank you.
It's beautiful.
He's got miles of swag that he doesn't even want to brag about. That's
I'm trying to be like Juan Floyd Thomas when I grow up.
No, man, aim high, not low. Don't. Love you, Doc.
Love you.
Well, let's turn it over to Dr. Floyd Thomas. He's taken over. So thank you.
All right. And once again, thanking Dr. Haynes for his amazing presentation. Also, I'm trying to figure out what I did wrong to Aaron and Rosemary for me to have to pick up this leg of the relay race. I've already been lapped by Stephen Handy and then dogged by Dr. Haynes. So I'm just going to share what I have with y'all. Hopefully it won't be long, but it'll be strong. So without further ado, okay, I just have a couple of PowerPoint slides I just wanted to post up just as a kind of way to keep the conversation moving. As I understood the assignment, it was just to try and make sense of how I come to this work, especially from an academics standpoint. And so when I sat down and thought about, try to collect my thoughts, this cluster of 6 issues or concerns bubble to the top of my consciousness. So I'll just tick through them as quickly as possible, and then we can always revisit them if there's any kind of question. First and foremost, and I've shared this with many of y'all before, that I take great pride in the fact that I was a union baby in terms of both my parents having been members of and their lives being shaped and impacted by their connection to organized labor. But what becomes interesting also in that dynamic is the idea that on the one hand, my father, he was a member of the policemen's union, right? The police union. And so seeing how that union operates both internally as well as how it operates within the kind of constellation of American culture and society was interesting, because as many of us hopefully are aware of, even in our current moment, right? The idea that although it operates under the umbrella of organized labor, it doesn't meet the same, it doesn't meet the same resistance from conservatives, I wonder why, but also there's a level at which it's set apart from, the kind of coalition of labor that we've seen, especially in its more left or center left configuration, right? And then also add to that issues of qualified immunity and all these other kind of issues that, for me, gave me a kind of cold water to the face feeling about that dimension of labor. But then I also had my mother, and my mother was a member of 1199. And what became fascinating about that aspect of our life was, at a moment in time when my mother was, she was working in a hospital, and at the time she was a nurse's assistant, a nurse's aide, and she wanted to make the leap to become a registered nurse. 1199 provided my mother a full scholarship to go to nursing school. And, it was, full scholarship and also a stipend, a support, because at the time it was, she was a single working mother. But there was a stipulation within the union rules, which meant that at that time, it might have changed in years since, but at that time in the late 70s, early 80s, if she became a nurse, that would make her ineligible for union membership. So follow me with this. The union was subsidizing her educational and employment opportunities, even if it meant sacrificing her presence, her membership as a union member, right? And so that to me, you know, even as a young child, but now even as a grown man, was mind blowing, right? It was not in the self-interest of the organization to promote and provide her a gateway to greater opportunity, but it did so anyway. So with that kind of two-hand effect, I was able to see both the bad, what I could imagine some of the more, you know, unsavory aspects of union life, but then I was also witnessing some of the more glorious aspects of union activity. All right, and I'll leave that there. Next, you know, this is my story, right? In terms of my faith journey, right? You know, I gotta tell it like it is. I was born and raised Catholic, right? And what became interesting about my early formation was that, you know, some of the heroes of my early experience, right? You know, aside from, you know, setting aside folks like, you know, Augustine and Aquinas and cats like that, you know, I would be a reader of people like Michael Harrington, the author of The Other America, right? I was deeply impressed by the work of Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker Organization. You know, the heroes of my childhood were the Berrigan brothers and Oscar Romero, right? You know, the Latino liberation theologians. So, but they were not the folks that my church at that time centered on. And, you know, when especially I got to, you know, a good grown age of maybe 18 or so and went to college, I broke away with the church of my youth. And, you know, I spent a number of years kind of wandering and wrestling with faith issues, right? You know, I had also been, and I'll talk about this momentarily, I had also been inspired by, you know, the kind of vision and viewpoints of Malcolm X, right? So, you know, the Nation of Islam and his trajectory were always on my mind. And, you know, becoming more enamored and, you know, receptive to, you know, Bob Marley and you know, because as I'll talk about in a second, you know, my Jamaican roots, right? So Rastafarianism and the kind of political, but also prophetic dimensions of religion were deep there. But thankfully, you know, as many stories go, I met a woman and fell in love, and she was able, through her example and through her expression, right, you know, compel me to think about church again. And so when she and I together got on this road of relationship, the church that called most powerfully to me became the Baptist church, the Black Baptist church to be most specific. And so wrestling with how that tradition came into existence and lent fuel to fire, right, to so much of who and what I would become, especially in terms of, as I mentioned before, right, that the proud legacy of the church that emerged and became most powerfully embodied, not just by Dr. King, but as even you've witnessed on this morning, you know, through the preaching and teaching and just all around expression of Dr. Haynes here. You know, when a lot of people were asking, can you be radical and also religious, right? You know, I'm borrowing from Gaylord Wilmore's classic text, Black Religion and Black Radicalism. I looked to those examples right in front of us, literally, and said, yes, right? And so this was also seeping into my work and I think giving it life and longevity. Next, the fact of being a first generation Jamaican American, right? You know, more often than not, when I was growing up, you know, and folks were asking, you know, why did me and my family talk the way we talked? And a large part of it, you know, a center of that question was, you from the islands? And that notion of, you know, Black diversity, Black diaspora was crucial to my understanding about living in the world, right? So as much as, folks have been questioning and debating about issues of what is blackness, who's black? I mean, I think about this especially with Kamala Harris, right? Or Barack Obama, or, you take your pick. Are they black? Are they black enough? Are they black at all? Right? These are debates I've been wrestling with for, most of my time on this planet. So, that's also kind of worked its way into my my writing and my teaching and my very being. Being a Black Yankee, being born and raised in the urban post-industrial North has had more of an impact on me than I thought. But just the notion of wrestling with some of the questions that we're talking about now, questions of gentrification, questions of job creation, questions of how do you negotiate and navigate across the color line in especially a social context that was not explicitly defined by slavery, but was definitely defined by Jim and Jane Crow segregation, right? And it wasn't that, segregation was the rule of the day or the law of the land, but it was seeped into every kind of nook and cranny of the culture, but folks didn't, in polite society, didn't mention it or didn't grapple with it, right? But they understood that when you shouted out a place like Pastor Haynes did with Harlem, when you talked about, West Philadelphia, right? Fans of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air would know about that. When you talked about Jamaica Plains in Boston, right, or Roxbury, right? There are spots that are, Baltimore, right? The ways we envision certain northern spaces are racially encoded, but they just weren't encoded the same way. Next, the idea of growing up in the hip hop generation, but also part of Generation X, right? So there was this constant tension for folk like me to hover between, what's affectionately known in hip hop culture as a backpack kid, right? Someone, who might have had the audacity to keep reading books or things of that sort. But then on the flip side, being part of a whole generation that was largely being dismissed as slackers, right, in popular culture, right? When you think about the flannel shirt wearing, Timberland boots wearing, and what was ironic was, both then and now, like the level at which the hip hop kids and maybe the punk rock or grunge kids had more overlap than popular culture and society would have afforded, But when we're seeing now, and I'm proud to see, like, a lot of the millennials or a lot of the Gen Z youth who've taken on that mantle in ways and directions that I could have only dreamed or hoped of, right? And I'm seeing that, not to throw shade at the baby boomers or anything like that. No hate, only love. But the idea of the shifting kind of politics, right, that now didn't demonize, the kind of potential for a more expansive worldview than we previously grew up under. Which then leads finally to my point of view in terms of hope and trying to straddle between hope and history. That and I borrowed this expression from a late and dear mentor, Vincent Harding, right? The notion that the work that we're engaged in, right, has to matter, right? I'm inspired by Harding's writings. I'm inspired by the writings of folks like Howard Zinn. I'm inspired and driven by the work of folks like C.L.R. James and others, right? Angela Davis, who constantly remind me that, my own PhD advisor, Mary Frances Berry, quite literally wrote the book that's entitled "History Teaches Us to Resist," right? Right. So in my current work, and I'm just a pale imitation of those who came before me, but in the work I'm trying to do now, I'm trying to think about and talk about a history of liberation, right? Especially as it's framed and focused through the Black experience, right? And now, just for the sake of time, I'll go to this last slide. An exercise I often share with some of my students and try to get them to think about what they're doing. You know, I offer up, this exercise called food for thought. And so just like you are what you eat in terms of physical food, I believe you are what you read, right? That's been a large part of this exercise. So to get them, and ultimately myself, to think about, okay, how do you process the things you intake? So for instance, and this list can obviously, you could do like a 12 days of Christmas kind of deal with this, right? You could stack this however you want. But for the sake of time, 4 authors that influenced me, without a doubt, Zora Neale Hurston, right? I take her to heart, like, in everything from wordplay to the fact that, the stories she wrote were intentionally about African-American experience, especially Black Southern experience. But then by the time you get to the end of either reading one of her essays or books or just over her entire life, it went from intentionally to incidentally racialized. And that's not any disrespect. It just is what it is. Robin D.G. Kelley, I've shouted him out before, but his writing and research made it possible for a kid like me to imagine that there was space and place to talk about labor, to talk about resistance, but then to also have fun with it and talk about culture, to talk about various levels of various realms and spheres of labor activity and resistance, right? So he could talk about sharecroppers in Alabama, but then he could also talk about musicians in the New York jazz scene and not find any contradiction about their labor struggles, right? Toni Morrison, the late great. I mean, for someone who could wrestle with some of the darkest and grimiest, literally, concerns of American culture and history, and yet make it beautiful, make it powerful, make it relevant. And in a similar fashion, in the theological realm, James Cone, right? Moving throughout his bibliography from, Black theology and Black power all the way to, said I won't go and tell nobody, right? I mean, just the length and breadth of his theological vision, but also the level of which he was able to share his vulnerability and transparency with the world. Books that radicalized me. I've written about this in other spaces, so I won't belabor it, but Autobiography of Malcolm X. I found that in my mom's stack of books when I was a young child, maybe 9 or 10, read it, rocked my world. The Fire Next Time. Every time I look at Baldwin, as short as that book is, every time I look at Baldwin's writing, especially in that volume, I am mystified by how he knew so much about the world around him, and yet we still haven't learned those lessons yet. Last but not least, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. The fact that in that novel, which I mistook for a science fiction novel, I got to admit, I saw Invisible Man on the cover. I just jumped right in, and then even from the first couple of paragraphs, when he disabuses me and all the readers of their false assumption, he had me locked, right? And, once again, that was a book I found in my mother's college reading list, back when I was a preteen. But even to this day, now 40 some odd years later, it's still teaching me lessons. 2 books that I think about and wrestle with every day. Bell Hooks' Yearning. If y'all hadn't had a chance to look at that book, either in part or in full, every day she talks about, the politics of the Black kitchen table and how folks are able to wrestle with, as much as people in the academy were talking about postmodern this and blah, 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 structural that, her giving credibility to the common sense of everyday folk and being able to wrestle with, okay, what does it mean in a transgenerational space to talk your talk? Every day I'm mesmerized by her writing and her thinking. Souls of Black Folk by W.B. Du Bois. I could not and would not be doing what I'm able to without W.B. Du Bois making my very existence in this world possible. So, that's my debt. To think about what he thought about, to write about what he wrote about, and to know that even 100 some years later, he still did way better than I ever could right now. And last but not least, the book I always encourage every abolitionist or activist to wrestle with has to be Why We Can't Wait. Once again, as older I get, the wiser, smarter, better, stronger King gets. And so even to think about the origins of that book, I was just teaching a few days ago, Letter from a Birmingham Jail, which was actually the seed from which the rest of Why We Can't Wait grew. And just to see students, another crop of students here at the Divinity School, take some level of influence and inspiration from his writings, it's the gift that keeps on giving. All right, and I know that was fast, but I stand down. If there are any questions, I'll receive them.
This is great. Thank you. We've had 2 wonderful gifts, 3 with Pastor Handy's. You've just given, and would you mind sharing those slides with us?
Sure. Yeah. Let me see if I can do the magic. Hold on.
Yeah, or even just send me by email.
I'll drop it in the chat, but I'll also send it along to you. No worries.
Because I think that's a wonderful activity even for us all to think about. What you read is what you are. Something like that, I think is what you said.
Yeah. And that's the other thing too is to that point, Aaron, like especially when I would be, in settings trying to do the work, right? And this is something I inherit from, folks like Gramsci, right? The whole notion of organic intellectuals, right? This idea that folks dismiss their own intellectual activity, right? They think because, they're working a 9-to-5 job or, working in a kind of space that doesn't cherish and uplift, the fact that working people think and thinking people should work, which ironically enough, just to throw this into the hopper, when I was, as many folks on that PhD route have to scrounge around for a topic or some kind of, as I was mentioning with Pastor Haynes, right? When you're casting about to think about your dissertation, when I was able to stumble upon this subject of a Black Unitarian church in Harlem in the early 20th century, and then look at all the kind of various influences that ran through it, right? So its connection to, the Garvey movement, its connection to A. Philip Randolph and the Black socialist and communist movement. Obviously, it's kind of outlier relationship to the Black faith community in Uptown New York. It's also its connections and commitments to immigrants' rights struggles, right? And not just New York, but in the United States, especially at a time when immigrant rights were at a low ebb, right? Because of restrictionist policies dating back at least to the beginning of the 1920s. The fact that a pot could find its lid was just an amazing situation for me. So the fact that, once again, to match my commitments to a project that would then fuel and inspire the rest of my career thus far was great.
Thank you for this. I know I have a question particularly around, and I would picture this and note that Dr. Haynes is still here, that your reflections even on the role in returning to the church, I think are a wonderful dovetail with his earlier emphasis on the creating a vision of the church in a context, right?
Yeah.
We've got two other points. It's two other questions. We're at 11. So I want to make sure that we respect people's time. So if you do need to go, please do. Dr. Floyd Thomas, I want to be respectful of your time. I don't want to keep you here any longer. I wonder if we can turn to George and Jorg for their questions. And also, if it's okay, I might send you a question to just regarding that, especially the role of the Black Baptist Church as a countercultural space, right? As a counterpublic, right? It's really important, I think, for us, even thinking about the economic and political work that we're doing here. So we'll go to
Higginbotham. Yeah, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Righteous Discontent. Yeah, that was a foundational text for me as well. Yeah.
Yeah, amen. We're on the same wavelength. I love it. Let's go to George and Jorg, and I'll follow up offline.
Sure.
Thank you so much for the talk. And I was wondering, are there any other sorts of art or media that you receive that you sort of think through? Like, are there films that you think about, or TV shows, or radio broadcasts, or just like some painting you look at every day that kind of just sparks your imagination in some way?
All of the above. And that's part of the power of the influences in front of me was the fact that not treating, and that's I think a beautiful kind of concern here. I think the struggle is bound and determined not only by what we loathe, but by what we love, right? And it's the love in terms of culture, in terms of the things that feed the spirit, right? What is the, actually there are two books of the same name. Susan Smith's Dancing in the Street, but also Barbara Ehrenreich also borrows the same title. And both of them, although just tied by the title, also with Susan Smith, right? She talked about how Motown, and especially the song of that same name, Martha and the Vandellas, Dancing in the Street, was used as a kind of low-key anthem for revolution, and that, it was almost like this kind of Pied Piper thing. Everywhere the song would play, like in various parts of the 1960s, right? There would be urban uprisings or protests that accompany it. In that same sense, especially for my generation, right? And that's why I shouted out, lifted out the Gen Z and the hip hop generation thing, is that the barrage of movies, the barrage of television shows, the barrage of various musical genres and kind of pop culture or pulp fiction memes that become so embedded in my worldview, my vocabulary, that I can't remember a day when it wasn't necessary for me to make reference to, a TV show or a movie or a musical composition or something like that. So it's indispensable. And also in these days and times, right, the idea, the necessity to constantly feed your spirit when it feels like the world and the news around you are intent on grinding you down, right? In fact, that's a quote, right? Don't let the bastards grind you down. Okay. Anyway, so I don't have the time to go into the full catalog, but I'll share it with you at another time, George. Thank you.
Let's turn to Jorg.
This is probably a longer, the question doesn't have to be long, but the answer probably would be. So I don't suggest that we solve it now, but I think it would be helpful for us to keep this before us. And I'm asking the question of Juan because I know he has the answer to it. So this is not a facetious question, trying to figure out something else. But if you look at the list of books, what's really striking, from Bell Hooks, to King, W.E. Du Bois, and several of the others, there is always a connection of race and class. And I know this is something that you're concerned about also, Juan, but the reality is when people receive a lot of these authors, they don't see it. I mean, the way a lot of people in the Theological Academy are reading James Cone, they do not see that there is even that concern. I mean, there's some conversations, right? And I mean, in some ways, Cone and I sometimes had these fights. Sometimes it was a fight, you know, even how to bring it together. But in Cone's own work, you have a recognition of the importance of the economy, class, and so on. But so the question here is, you know, in a culture that doesn't really want to talk about that. I mean, the reason we can have King Day, you know, in some ways is because, you know, a lot of people think this is just about civil rights, and not that civil rights is not important or something that has to be, put out of context. But King, in some ways, became dangerous. Exactly, we all know this, right? When he then starts marching with the workers, and that goes on through all the 60s. This is not only happening in 68, but it's not happening, when people read this. And I think for a lot of our Vanderbilt students, we have the same problem. So my question to you is, how do you deal with those tensions? How do you bring them back? How do you help people see that they're connected? And I mean, that's probably a long answer, but I really think you have a lot to say, and maybe we'll have that conversation later, but just want to make sure that gets put out there.
No, thank you, York. And I think part and parcel of this is, and I'm once again, I'm inspired and led by, the kind of work that's emerged. Aaron was sharing in the thread about, remembering the late, great Katie Cannon, right? And the contribution of womanist scholars, right? I also think about the kind of work of critical race theorists. And I know that they've been getting a bad rap lately, especially from Cult 45, from the Oval Office. But when I think about that kind of work, when I think about the kind of work of, I'm also led here by Audre Lorde, right? She once famously said that, we shouldn't be a single issue movement because we're not single issue people, right? Intersectionality, the intertwining and interwoven nature of all of our struggles, of all our concerns towards human liberation, have to be tackled in a both and or all and rather than an either or, right? So many of our efforts have been divided about, as I was lifting up before, right? A notion that you either had to be religious or you had to be radical. Like you had to pick, as if, Jesus wasn't radical, right? The idea that, as we see now in the world around us, right, where unfortunately with the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, right, just recently, the notion that somehow, some way, folks who otherwise didn't recognize the totality of evil that's being manifested by Trumpism, but now, now that Roe is in question, or now, certain legal principles like stare decisis, right? That notion that settled law means something, right? And that same settled law can date back to Brown versus Board of Education, that just as it applies to Roe v. Wade, just as it applies to Marbury versus Madison, one of the first legal decisions the Supreme Court weighed in on. I mean, right, the unraveling of all of our rights, right? Whether you're in terms of labor rights, whether you're talking about women's rights, LGBTQ rights, civil rights, human rights, environment, the whole catalog and category, right? So hopefully this gets to the point of what you're asking, York, is the idea of, yeah, there are some issues that rise more to the surface or rise more immediately to focus, but we should never deny that in back of those things are other key concerns, right? So when Pastor Haynes is talking about, literally tackling Shingle Mountain, right? Taking on Shingle Mountain. Yeah, that's an environmental issue, but it's also environmental justice, economic justice, racial justice, right? Right. we're wrestling with always having to deal with all these things side by side rather than single file. So what I do in my writing, in my research, in my teaching, in my general conversation, hopefully is not fill a shot glass with a fire hose, but I'm steadily trying to illustrate that there's got to be a ways where we grapple with all these things in connection and in some level of communion, especially through collaboration. And we can talk about this later and longer elsewhere. Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. I think this is, yeah. I love that quote. We can't be a single issue movement because we're not single issue people.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and that's why we also got to lean on those who came before us, right? They might have actually said something worth hearing. So go figure.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Floyd Thomas. This was really wonderful. You've given us so much to think about. As you can tell, this has been it's a little mini. I feel like I'm back in the classroom, which is wonderful. This is really great. John and George and Benny are here. I love it.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all so much. Yeah, my heart was full over the events of the last basically last 4 years. But this has been a tonic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, so we'll follow up with everyone else via email because it looks like we've got just a